By the pivotal year of 1943, the strategic landscape of World War II had irrevocably shifted. The industrial heartland of the Third Reich found itself under an unrelenting siege from the skies, a campaign that transcended previous standards of aerial warfare. Massive formations of Allied heavy bombers were systematically dismantling Germany's war production capabilities, inflicting crippling damage. The Luftwaffe's conventional anti-aircraft defenses, including the otherwise fearsome 88mm Flak 36 gun, were proving inadequate against these high-flying, heavily armored aerial fortresses. This mounting crisis sparked a desperate, almost frenzied, search for what Hitler termed a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon, a technological marvel capable of instantaneously turning the tide of the air war. While much of this effort focused on visible advancements like jet fighters and guided missiles, a secretive, radical fringe of German scientists, operating outside mainstream military thinking, began to explore far more esoteric realms of physics. They sought to harness an invisible, omnipresent force, sound energy, with the chilling ambition to convert atmospheric vibrations into an instrument of mass destruction. The core research for the sonic cannon, or Schallkanone, can be traced directly to the radical theories of Dr. Richard Wallauschek, an Austrian physicist whose unconventional ideas found fertile ground within the desperate Wunderwaffe program. Wallauschek was convinced that existing kinetic and explosive weaponry was inherently inefficient. He proposed harnessing a fundamental force of nature, sound. His primary research was conducted at a highly secretive experimental station located near the remote, alpine town of Lofer, Austria. This facility, originally established for researching mountain artillery, offered the perfect cover of isolation and strategic importance for such outlandish projects. Here, Wallauschek and his small, specialized team were granted the resources to transform their theoretical understanding of sound waves into a tangible, if grotesque, instrument of war. Their mission: to weaponize the very air itself, turning atmospheric vibrations into a deadly, invisible force capable of incapacitating or killing an enemy. Wallauschek's terrifying concept was not merely about creating a loud noise. It delved into the far more sinister realm of infrasound and organ resonance. He theorized that if a sound wave of sufficient intensity could be generated at specific, extremely low frequencies, particularly in the range of 44 Hertz, just at the edge of human hearing, these frequencies would precisely match the natural resonant frequencies of certain human internal organs. Organs rich in fluid, such as the kidneys, spleen, and liver, would, upon exposure to a high-amplitude wave, begin to vibrate sympathetically. The intended effect was catastrophic. Prolonged or intense exposure would lead to violent mechanical compression and expansion of these tissues, inducing immediate symptoms ranging from severe nausea, disorientation, vertigo, and uncontrollable involuntary responses, to ultimately causing internal hemorrhaging and rapid death. The pilot or soldier would effectively be shaken to pieces from the inside out, without a single visible external wound, a truly horrific, physics-based method of assassination. The culmination of Dr. Wallauschek's terrifying theories manifested in the Schallkanone prototype, a device that looked more like a piece of experimental laboratory equipment than a conventional weapon. This anti-aircraft sound cannon was a bulky, stationary, yet deceptively intricate apparatus. Its primary components were twin parabolic reflectors, two colossal, concave dishes, the largest of which spanned over 3 meters, approximately 10.5 feet, in diameter. These were crucial for focusing and directing the sound energy into a tight, destructive beam. Positioned behind the apex was a sophisticated methane-oxygen combustion chamber. The gas mixture was ignited in a continuous, rapid series of controlled explosions, estimated to be between 800 and 1,500 pulses per second. The ingenuity lay in the detonation sequence. The shock wave from each blast was engineered to mechanically trigger the subsequent explosion, creating a self-sustaining, high-velocity chain reaction that generated a relentless, focused stream of low-frequency pressure waves. The efficacy of the Schallkanone was not measured by explosive force, but by the sheer, overwhelming pressure it could generate within its focused beam. German researchers employed instrumentation to measure the exact intensity of the sound wave. Their findings were chilling. At a relatively close range of approximately 50 to 60 meters, 165 to 200 feet, from the emitter, the focused sound beam achieved a peak pressure exceeding an astonishing 1,000 millibars. This means the cannon could generate a localized pressure wave nearly equivalent to a full atmosphere of force. Scientists calculated that sustained exposure for just 30 to 40 seconds within this zone would be unequivocally lethal to a human target, leading to internal organ failure and collapse. While highly successful on paper at close range, this measurement simultaneously highlighted the weapon's ultimate vulnerability and its devastating close-quarters potential. Despite the terrifying close-range test results, the Schallkanone was ultimately defeated by an immutable law of physics, the rapid dissipation of sound energy over distance. The extreme intensity required for lethality diminished drastically as the focused beam traveled. Even under optimistic laboratory conditions, the range at which the weapon could reliably cause incapacitation or death was strictly limited to approximately 50 to 200 meters, 165 to 650 feet. This fundamental flaw rendered the sonic cannon strategically useless against its intended targets. The Allied heavy bombers, which typically operated at altitudes ranging from 6,000 to 8,000 meters. At these operational distances, the powerful sound wave would have diffused into harmless ambient noise, completely ineffective against the aircraft and its crew. The audacious dream of an invisible killer from the skies was thus shattered by the cold, hard reality that, in this design, sound simply could not carry enough destructive force over the vast distances required for effective anti-aircraft warfare. Beyond its crippling range limitations, the Schallkanone was plagued by a host of practical and logistical nightmares that cemented its irrelevance as a deployable weapon. The entire apparatus was enormous, unwieldy, and inherently stationary, requiring extensive support infrastructure for its operation, including continuous fuel lines for the methane and oxygen. Its sheer bulk made it impossible to conceal, rendering it an immediate and priority target for enemy air reconnaissance. More critically, the cannon's most vital components, the large, delicate parabolic reflectors, were astonishingly fragile. They were constructed from relatively thin metal and were highly susceptible to damage. Even a single rifle round or a small piece of shrapnel could easily deform the precise curvature of the reflector, instantly compromising its ability to focus the sound wave. This vulnerability meant the Wonder weapon was a logistical liability rather than an asset on the dynamic and hostile battlefield. The intense secrecy and often chaotic nature of the late-war Wunderwaffe program meant that the Schallkanone frequently became confused with other similar, physics-based experimental weapons in both German and Allied intelligence reports. These included the Vortex gun Wallauschek, which used an explosive charge to generate a high-speed, coal dust-laced air vortex intended to disrupt aircraft wings, and the wind cannon Luftkanone, another device using pressure to create a powerful, focused blast of air. While the mechanisms differed, focused sound versus swirling air, all these projects shared core characteristics: radical ingenuity, a reliance on unconventional physics, and most importantly, an ultimate failure due to severe limitations in range, reliability, and deployment practicality. This internal and external confusion highlights the sheer desperation and lack of centralized focus in the German research community by the war's end. The full, unsettling story of the Schallkanone and the secretive Lofer research facility was finally uncovered after the war by the massive Allied intelligence-gathering effort, primarily spearheaded by the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS. Through the interrogation of captured personnel and the examination of seized documents, the details of Dr. Wallauschek's sonic weapon were pieced together. Reports, such as the May 1946 CIOS publication chillingly titled Noise That Kills, confirmed the weapon's design and technical specifications. These reports validated the scientific ambition of the project but, crucially, concluded that the cannon's military value was very doubtful due to its aforementioned lack of range. Significantly, these investigations also confirmed that, unlike some of the Third Reich's other heinous experiments, the sonic cannon was never tested on human subjects, though tests on laboratory animals were reported. The legacy of the German acoustic cannon is not found on the battlefield but in the history of science and ethics. While the Schallkanone was a spectacular failure as an implement of war, its underlying principles, the concept of directed energy, the manipulation of specific sound frequencies, and the idea of non-kinetic incapacitation, did not simply disappear with the fall of the Reich. The captured data and the theories of Wallauschek and his peers entered the massive pool of German technical knowledge absorbed by the Allied powers, particularly during the Cold War. In a refined and ethically controlled manner, the research into low-frequency effects and acoustic pressure continued, later influencing the development of modern acoustic hailing devices and less lethal crowd control technology. The Schallkanone thus remains a haunting, terrifying footnote, a failed weapon that nevertheless foreshadowed a new, complex frontier in modern warfare. The profound and often paradoxical prioritization of esoteric weapons like the Schallkanone can only be understood within the overarching strategic vision, or rather desperation, of Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments and War Production. As the tide of the war decisively turned against Germany, the emphasis within the Reich's leadership shifted from the mass production of proven, conventional weaponry to the rapid development of revolutionary tiebreakers, the so-called Wunderwaffen. Speer, himself a shrewd organizer and a man often captivated by the promise of technological superiority, allocated crucial, increasingly scarce resources, enormous sums of funding, the best available scientific and engineering personnel, and vital raw materials, to projects deemed futuristic and potentially war-winning, even when their practical viability was highly questionable. The very existence of the Lofer facility, operating at full capacity at a time of crushing industrial pressure and widespread material shortages, is a stark testament to the almost mystical belief within the highest echelons of the regime that a singular, non-conventional technological leap was the only remaining path to stave off defeat. This deliberate redirection of resources ultimately meant that fewer conventional aircraft, tanks, and artillery pieces, which were desperately needed on the eastern and western fronts, were produced, highlighting a profound strategic miscalculation fueled by desperate, almost messianic hope. While the primary, stated goal of the Schallkanone was overtly military, the destruction or incapacitation of enemy bombers, its terrifying psychological potential was undoubtedly a significant, if often unstated, motivating factor. In the context of the V weapons program, the V-1 flying bomb and V-2 ballistic missile, the Nazi regime had already demonstrated its profound understanding of and willingness to exploit weapons capable of inflicting terror and shattering civilian morale. A functional sonic weapon, a source of unseen, debilitating force, would have represented the ultimate form of psychological warfare. Imagine an enemy being attacked by an invisible, undefendable force that targeted the body's most fundamental biological processes. Even if the weapon's military application against high-altitude aircraft proved limited, the mere rumor of its existence or sporadic, devastating use against frontline troops or lightly fortified civilian areas could have sown a powerful, paralyzing fear, convincing the enemy that the Reich possessed unstoppable, unearthly technology. This would have dramatically bolstered the internal propaganda narrative of the invincible Wunderwaffe, potentially extending the conflict by undermining enemy resolve. Wallauschek's meticulous selection of the 44 Hertz frequency, or the near-infrasound range, was not arbitrary. It was a deliberate choice rooted in a deep, albeit ultimately flawed, understanding of bioacoustics and human physiology. Researchers at Lofer theorized that this specific low-frequency range critically matched the known resonant frequencies of the larger, fluid-filled cavities and highly elastic tissues within the human torso, such as the lungs, abdominal organs, kidneys, spleen, liver, and even the circulatory system. Their hypothesis suggested that while higher frequencies might cause superficial damage, like eardrum rupture, a lower frequency, at extreme amplitude, would bypass auditory defenses entirely and cause maximum, insidious disruption to internal physiological function. The 44 Hz problem thus represented the immense technical challenge of generating this specific low frequency with enough sustained, focused power to maintain its destructive pressure over any militarily useful distance, a feat that, as history would prove, required an impractical amount of energy and an emitter aperture size far larger than even the prototype's massive dishes. The inherent, grave dangers in developing a weapon specifically designed to induce internal trauma were not lost on the dedicated, yet surely apprehensive, research staff at the Lofer facility. The operational crew assigned to the Schallkanone project was highly specialized, limited in number, and worked under conditions of extreme secrecy and constant personal risk. Post-war intelligence reports and interrogations suggest that extraordinarily stringent safety protocols were not merely recommended, but absolutely essential, to protect the technicians themselves from accidental exposure to their own deadly creation. This likely involved the construction of heavy, sound-dampening control bunkers, the mandatory use of specialized protective gear, including advanced ear protection and possibly vibration-absorbing suits, and strict adherence to predetermined safe distances from the emitter during all pulse detonation tests. The chilling paradox of the Schallkanone was that while it proved strategically ineffective at its intended range, it remained acutely lethal at close quarters, forcing a constant, high-stakes risk assessment that dramatically complicated every aspect of its setup, calibration, and experimental firing, adding another layer of operational impracticality to its already problematic design. The Schallkanone represented a stark confluence of high-precision engineering and a voracious appetite for critical raw materials, creating an insurmountable dilemma for a nation under siege. Its key components, the massive 3-meter parabolic reflectors, demanded not just steel, but high-quality, meticulously shaped, and perfectly polished steel, a resource increasingly diverted to the production of conventional tanks, submarines, and aircraft components where its need was far more immediate and proven. Furthermore, the specialized pulse detonation engine required a constant, reliable supply of pure methane gas and oxygen, commodities that were becoming luxurious and strategically critical on the home front, often rationed or diverted for other vital industrial processes. These fundamental material constraints ensured that even if the prototype had somehow proven a marginal success, any realistic dream of mass-producing the cannons for widespread air defense across the Reich was an absolute fantasy. The project thus became a significant sinkhole for finite, precious resources, starkly showcasing the inherent conflict between ambitious technological vision and the crippling, inescapable reality of total war and a collapsing industrial base. The development of the Schallkanone was not an entirely isolated piece of fringe research. It drew, at least conceptually, from Germany's advanced understanding of acoustic detection technology. Throughout the war, German engineers excelled in naval acoustics, successfully deploying highly sensitive hydrophones for submarine detection and developing devastating acoustic torpedoes that homed in on ship propeller noise. It is highly probable that the same scientists and engineers familiar with the principles of passive acoustic reception, listening for the enemy, were tasked with reversing the process, turning reception into focused, active attack. The ability to precisely tune a hydrophone to a specific ship's propeller frequency, for instance, may have erroneously fueled the belief that they could similarly tune the Schallkanone to a specific, destructive human organ frequency. This intellectual lineage demonstrates that the sonic cannon was conceived as an aggressive, yet fundamentally flawed, extension of proven, existing German acoustic warfare capabilities. The end of the war brought the dramatic question of accountability and acquisition for the thousands of German scientists involved in the vast array of Wunderwaffe projects. The fate of Dr. Richard Wallauschek and his immediate team remains a point of intense historical investigation. While major scientific figures were famously absorbed into US and Soviet programs via Operation Paperclip for their work on rocketry or aviation, researchers behind more unconventional, or ultimately failed, weapons often faced different scrutiny. The sonic cannon research, with its focus on bioacoustics and human physiological disruption, was certainly of high interest to Allied intelligence. The captured technical data detailing the frequency analysis and pressure measurements was rigorously studied. Wallauschek's unique knowledge base and theoretical findings on low-frequency effects almost certainly contributed to the pool of scientific data that later informed research into both crowd control and acoustic countermeasures during the early stages of the Cold War, despite the failure of his ultimate weapon. The most subtle, yet ultimately devastating, scientific challenge faced by the Lofer team was the phenomenon of nonlinear sound propagation. The fundamental design assumption was that the high-pressure, focused beam would travel as a stable, coherent sound packet. In reality, at the immense acoustic intensities required for lethality, the sound wave itself begins to distort as it travels through the air. The positive phase of the wave, the compression peak, travels faster than the negative phase, the rarefaction trough, causing the waveform to rapidly steepen into a characteristic sawtooth profile and generating intense, chaotic shock wave. This distortion rapidly extracts energy from the beam and disperses it laterally, accelerating the rate of energy loss far beyond what was predicted by simple linear acoustics models. This unanticipated physical effect ensured that the cannon's potentially lethal intensity dissipated even faster than their limited tests indicated, making a focused, long-range acoustic attack fundamentally impossible with that early design. As the crippling, inherent range limitations of the Schallkanone became undeniably clear, the desperate German designers briefly explored alternative, close-range deployment scenarios in a futile effort to salvage the massive investment. Ideas included utilizing the weapon for close-range ground support, where troops positioned in trenches or light bunkers could be incapacitated prior to a physical ground assault. This concept, however, required the cannon to be deployed dangerously close to the enemy front line, making it a prime target. Another idea was for harbor or coastal defense against light vessels or landing craft. In this scenario, the immense pressure wave could potentially damage sensitive navigational equipment or instantly disable crew members at close quarters on the water surface. Crucially, the weapon's inherent fragility, bulk, and complete lack of mobility consistently precluded any practical, sustained battlefield or coastal deployment, ensuring its permanent status as an extravagant, ultimately abandoned prototype. While the Schallkanone was a spectacular failure of a war machine, the core concept of using directed sound energy for tactical effect did not end in 1945. Modern acoustic hailing devices, AHDs, such as the Long-Range Acoustic Device, LRAD, are today used globally by military and law enforcement for non-lethal crowd dispersal, perimeter defense, and long-range communication. The key distinction lies in both scale and intent. Modern devices operate at much higher frequencies and are engineered strictly for non-lethal effects, pain, disorientation, communication, at greater operational ranges. Crucially, they lack the sustained, destructive bioacoustic pressure required for the Schallkanone's murderous intent. The modern echo of the Nazi cannon thus serves as a powerful, unsettling illustration. The same underlying principles of physics can be harnessed for both communication and terror, leaving military strategists and ethicists to continually navigate the complex line between non-lethal crowd control and the outright weaponization of the acoustic environment.